I'm currently reading about the 100 Years' War, and let me tell you something. It has been a lot more interesting than I expected. I was expecting this history to be kind of bland. I was expecting it to involve knights and men in shining armor and chivalry, and of course, I was expecting some stories of massacres, maybe some atrocities here and there. Well, I was definitely expecting atrocities, I'll tell you that. But I was not expecting it to be as atrocious as it was. The 100 Years' War. Oh my goodness. It was like World War I. I mean, in the standard of the Middle Ages, it was like World War I. Literally millions of people, between 2 to 3 million people, were killed during the 100 Years' War. For the standards of that time period, that is immensely high. That is an extremely high body count. That's huge. That is a giant ocean of blood. It was so horrendous. And human life, I mean, I was expecting some respect for human life, and yes, there was, to a certain degree, respect for human life, and that's all because of Christianity, Christian ethics. But there was a lot of indifference to human suffering. Oh, you are French. You're not a part of my political faction. Doesn't matter if you're really starving to death. Who really cares? So, for example, there was this town called Rouen, and the English were taking it over. The English besieged this French town, Rouen. And they just cut the town off from food. The people inside were starving. It came to the point where people were eating vegetable peels. Well, food was down so bad. There was so little food left in this place that they said, okay, take the poorest of the poor and then just kick them out. That way we don't have to worry about feeding them. So they took thousands of poor people, mainly mothers, children, elderly people, and they just threw them out. Well, the English, they were surrounding the whole town. And so these people, these starving, poor peasants, were not allowed to just leave the premises. They had to stay between the town and the English army that was besieging the town. So they were pretty much inside of a pit. There was this pit surrounding the town, and they were stuck inside this deep pit, kind of like a moat. And they were just stuck there. Starving, thousands upon thousands of people just starving in a pit, helplessly. Some of the English felt bad for them, so they gave them some bread here and there, but it surely was not enough. And the English said, no, we can't feed them. We have an army to feed, but we're not going to let them out. I mean, just at least let them out. I'm reading this book like I'm reading a horror movie, like I'm reading a very, very sad novel, but it's so much sadder than any fiction because this actually happened. And I'm like, my heart is breaking for these people, even though this story happened centuries ago. I just feel for them. Like they're just starving. And then they said that you could see just sheer human suffering in this pit. Dead women just lying there, and the little baby sucking on the mom's teat, trying to get whatever drop of milk was left in there. And then you had children that were dead, and the mothers are trying to breastfeed them, but the kid's basically dead. The kid is starving, and elderly people dying, people screaming from the starvation, and it's just, oh my God. I am shocked that there hasn't been a serious movie made about the 100 Years' War. This is a horror movie. This is an utter horror movie. Now, they did make a film back in the 90s. I think it was called The Messenger. And it stars that woman who played in Resident Evil. That woman who has a Balkan last name. I don't remember her name. But that film did show some of the reality of the atrociousness of the 100 Years' War. Especially in the beginning of the film, it's pretty dark. But other than that, I mean, the film doesn't really get down to the nitty-gritty of the 100 Years' War, although to a certain extent it does show some of the evil that was done. But I'm talking like a Saving Private Ryan style movie, but in the world of the Middle Ages. Now that would be an amazing, eye-opening film. But just the sheer horror that was going on. And I'm reading these stories and I'm thinking, where's the Christianity? Where's the Christian ethics? Where's the chivalry? Where are all of these axioms and these moral principles that we hear about when hearing about the Middle Ages? I mean, people talk about the Crusades, zeal, and all this stuff. I mean, there was a lot of evil-ass people back in those days. And the whole thing with the Crusades, let me just let my heart bleed out a little bit here on this video. This is one of those flow of consciousness type videos. A lot of people get sucked into this idealism about the Middle Ages. I've been there, believe me, for years. From like the years 2013, or even before that, maybe even from the years 2008 or 2007 when I started really reading about the Crusades, all the way up until like 2018-ish. I really had a lot of idealism for the Middle Ages, and I thought, wow, what a golden era. And I remember I knew a guy, he was this Italian dude, but he actually graduated, I want to say from Oxford, and he had a degree in medieval history, European medieval history. And he told me, he said, and he was an Italian guy, but he spoke in a perfect English accent. He said, there was no golden era of Christendom. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I've read the history. And I thought maybe he was just being a liberal. He was just being a lefty. He was being a little bit woke. Maybe it was just the influence of Oxford speaking. Who knows? But no. I'm not sure. I don't think there really ever was a golden era. If there was one, maybe you could find it somewhere in the Byzantine kingdom, in the Byzantine Empire. Maybe. Help me out here. But a lot of these Christians back in the Middle Ages, they became obsessed with Jerusalem. And the Europeans, they were killing each other so much that the Catholic Church said, we got to find a way to get these Europeans to unite so they wouldn't have to kill each other all the time. Have them just unite and kill the Muslims. Yeah, that's a great idea. So they said, all right, everybody, let's go on crusade and let's go invade the Holy Land because we're Israel. The church is Israel, so therefore that land belongs to us. Israel belongs to us. So they went to the Holy Land, and they became almost like Christian Zionists, like Catholic medieval Zionists. We are Israel. We're the true Jews. We are the successors of Joshua who invaded Canaan, and now we are re-invading Canaan, and the Muslims are the Canaanites. And that's how they saw things, believe it or not. They took Old Testament stories, and then they applied it to themselves. And so they invaded the Holy Land. They established this Latin kingdom, which lasted for numerous centuries. And then they started fighting each other. Christians actually started killing each other in the Holy Land. You read stories about Italian medieval Christians killing each other in the Holy Land. They start killing each other. Not only that, but they actually did massacres of the Muslims, not saying the Muslims were innocent. The Muslims did very atrocious things. That's one of the reasons why the Christians went to the Holy Land. It was to respond to Muslim atrocities. But at the same time, the Christians, I think, they got way too fixated on the land, on the Holy Land. And they started to see themselves as almost like Jews. Like, we're here, we're the real inheritors of this land. And they became obsessed with it. And they completely ignored that verse in Zechariah where God, speaking through the prophet Zechariah, says, I will cut asunder anyone who uplifts Jerusalem. And here they were, uplifting Jerusalem, revering this city, when Jesus himself in the Gospels is telling Jerusalem, 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 if only you could be like the little chicklings, the little baby chickens hiding under their mother's wing. Then I would have saved you. But you have rejected me. You have chosen not to be with me. You have chosen not to be under me. And so Jerusalem, you're going to be destroyed. There was no fixation on a land in Christianity. And so the Catholic Church, I think, learned its lesson. That's why you don't really hear about Catholic Zionism. You don't really hear about any sort of obsession or fixation with the actual physical land of the Holy Land coming out of the Vatican, because maybe they learned their lesson. But at that time, I think there was a lot of weird demonic hysteria. You hear about peasants wanting to go to the Holy Land, even though the Pope told them not to because they had no military training, and they saw a duck and they said, oh, the duck is sent to us by God. Let us follow the duck. Yeah, you can actually read up on this. It's pretty crazy. And they eventually got attacked by the Turks, who butchered them, and almost all of them were wiped out. Almost all of them were annihilated. And then you read about, and this is one of the most horrifying things that came out of Crusader history. You read about the sacking of Constantinople These Christians were supposed to go to Jerusalem. A whole bunch of these sort of Frankish mercenaries from France, they decide to go rogue. They go to Constantinople. They end up getting involved in some sort of political controversy. And they just take over the city of Constantinople, sack the whole city, rape, slaughter, pillage, do mass looting. I mean, utter savagery, absolute savagery. And there was Satan influencing the minds of these people. Fixate yourself on a land. Fixate yourself on the Holy Land. Fixate yourself on this. And then before you know it, you have supposed Christians raping, pillaging, and butchering other Christians, and it's just absolutely demonic. And they also established a Latin kingdom over Constantinople. And you read about this sort of thing happening even in our own modern era. You have, for example, the Maronite Christians in Lebanon in the 1980s butchering Palestinians. This happened, I want to say, in 1982 in the horrific massacres of Sabra and Shatila. And they actually went into these refugee camps in the early 80s with the support of Israel, and they were part of this. They were a part of this ethno-nationalistic paramilitary organization called the Kataib or the Pillage, and these were people who called themselves Christians. They claimed Jesus Christ as their savior, and they were, and they still are, fixated on this saint called Saint Charbel. That's their main saint, Saint Charbel. And they went into these refugee camps and they just butchered thousands of people, raped, butchered, looted, stole. I mean, there was one story I read where a phalangist sees a little Palestinian girl with an earring, and he says, "Is this earring gold?" And she says, "No." And he says, "You're lying to me." And he rips the whole little earring from her ear and then kills her, just shoots her or murders her and slaughters her somehow. And they say that in the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, you could see just a pit full of bodies, like something out of the freaking 1930s and 40s. I mean, it's just absolutely horrific. And this was done by people who claimed Christianity. And what is the symbol of these Phoenician nationalists? It's the cedar tree. And it's amazing. In the Bible, Satan is described as a cedar. And here they are using the cedar tree as their symbol. I just find that pretty ironic. But again, you have these stories of people claiming Christianity doing horrific things. And yet in the New Testament, you have people who were supposed to be the priests and the scholars of God killing the Son of God. See, everyone wants to talk about, I don't know, pagans and Muslims and this and that. The biggest enemy is right in your midst. And when you read, I mean, you can read about the Crusades, but medieval history is so huge. It's like an ocean of information. And to just focus on the battles between Christians and Muslims, it's only a part of medieval history. It's like when people talk about Charles Martel. How come you don't talk about the battle between Charles Martel and the Muslims? Well, actually, I have. But one thing about Charles Martel, and you'll notice this very quickly when you start reading up on his history, is most of the battles that Charles Martel was fighting was not against Muslims. It was against other Europeans. So going back to the 100 Years' War, you read about all these horrors. I mean, mass starvation, rape, killing, all because of war. And there were these people who were basically people who went out to war for loot. I mean, the reason why they went to war wasn't because they loved the King of England or something like that. They were people who would go from England to France just to fight, kill, and loot. They loved the life of a knight because they loved the intensity of battle. They loved the fray, but at the same time, they also loved that they could have the freedom to steal as much as they wanted, and they could just go back to England rich. And they would go around to random villages, pillage, kill, steal, rape, and they loved it. They loved it. And there was this group of pillagers. They called themselves the Flares, and this is mentioned in this book that I've been reading. This is The 100 Years' War by Desmond Seward. Very informative read so far. Very informative read. I'm almost done with it. But there was a guy, his name was Richard Venables, and he led a group of people called the Flares. Now, why were they called the Flares? Well, what does it mean to flay somebody? It literally means to skin them, to rip their skin out of their bodies. And these people would go out and they would... One of the reasons why they would call them flares is because they would just take everything off of you. They would take the clothes off your back. So in a way, they were like skinning you. So they would just rob everything. So the author here says they took their name from their custom of stripping victims to the skin, and it gets worse, even flaying them alive. So the name that was given to him is both figurative and literal. They would flay you, they would skin you to this in the sense that they would take everything off your back except the skin on your body. But at times they would also take the skin off of your body. It was that horrific. And then you read about the civil war that was going on in France at the time between the Burgundians and the Armagnacs. And this whole thing started because, well, the king of France, Charles VI, he went insane. There was a French king, Charles VI, who went insane. He was on a little riding journey with his friends. And out of nowhere, this guy takes a sword and just starts hacking the people around him to death. And he murdered 4 people with his sword. And you ask yourself, how in the hell does this happen? And it happened. And he had this fear that he was made out of glass, and that if he fell down, he would shatter to pieces. And Charles VI also had this idea. I think he had this idea that he was a wolf or something like that. It's demonic. I mean, this is all demonic possession. And yes, demonic possession. I think it's quite obvious. And so he went insane. And he could not really govern France really effectively, efficiently. He could not govern France. So what ended up happening was that his brother would rule when he was, at certain times his brother would rule, and in certain times his uncle was ruling. And so it came to the point where this brother of his and this uncle of his, they were just all thinking to themselves, we're kind of running this thing. We're kind of running this kingdom. So you had Louis, the Duke of Orleans, and then you also had Philip, who was the Duke of Burgundy. And I think Philip was his uncle. Louis was his brother. I'm pretty certain I'm correct on that. But anyway, so the Duke of Burgundy and the Duke of Orleans, they end up becoming rivals. And France got split up between people who wanted the Duke of Burgundy to rule and people who wanted the Duke of Orleans to rule. So it started this whole civil war called the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, or vice versa. And it lasted forever. And it was absolutely horrific. And it came to the point where the Burgundians wanted the English to rule French, and then the Armagnacs wanted the French to rule France. And the Burgundians would have told you that the Armagnacs were basically demons. That the way that they would kill was just absolutely horrendous. And this was happening in the middle of Christendom, 14th century Christendom. And you read about just absolute, utter horrors. Just absolute, utter horrors. And you read about this type of carnage and this type of evil going even into the First World War. I was thinking about this today. The Holy Roman Empire, the last of the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, which ended in World War I, at the end of World War I, right? That was the end of the Habsburg/Holy Roman Empire. Well, it wasn't very holy. When they invaded Serbia in the beginning of World War I, they used Croatian soldiers to invade Serbia. And they knew that the biggest enemies of the Serbs, the people who hated the Serbs more than anyone, was the Croatians. And I've talked about this before, but the Ottoman Empire ruled Serbia for 500 years. And a lot of people were killed under the Ottoman Empire. But when the Serbs were under the reign of terror of the Nazi Croatian Ustashi, in just a small number of years, literally hundreds of thousands of Serbs were butchered. So you can say that tons of Serbs were killed under the Ottomans, and you would be correct, but that was within a span of 500 years. Under the Croatians, in just a small number of years, you literally have hundreds of thousands of people butchered. That's how horrendous these people were, these Croatian nationalists were. And so the Croatians, I mean, they killed in the most horrendous ways you can imagine. Just, you can look this up. This is not very much so talked about. It's not commonly talked about, but you read about people getting chopped up to pieces, women being raped. I mean, people being skinned up. It was just so horrific. And that was World War I. That was World War I. People don't talk about that. And World War I would eventually just continue on as World War II. I mean, it's essentially the same war. Only difference, one of the big differences is that the Germans adopted a hardcore nationalistic, Darwinistic ideology. German nationalism was there before, but it was there in a different way. But it was all just evil. Anyway, you find it right there, my friends. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.